Nukes. Weapons with unmatched destructive capability that make other countries think twice about attacking you. They give your country prestige and influence in international politics and help show off your country's industrial capacity. Everybody wants one, but only a handful of powerful countries have ever constructed these destructive weapons. Here's why and how every nuclear country got its nuke. It's World War II. Fearful the Germans would develop a bomb before the Allies, the United States invested immense resources into building its own bomb. In 1943, the United Kingdom signed the Quebec Agreement with the United States that merged its nuclear program, dubbed the tube alloys, into the American Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project began in 1942, and the U.S. began constructing secret facilities in New Mexico, Tennessee, Washington, and other secret locations to design, manufacture, and test the bomb, spending about $2.2 billion, or about $37 billion in today's money. More than 130,000 people eventually were official members of the Manhattan Project, but only about 400 got to witness the Trinity test in Alamogordo, New Mexico on July 16, 1945. The first nuclear explosion in human history resulted in a 25 kiloton yield explosion. After this successful test, the United States dropped the first nuclear bomb used in warfare a few weeks later over Hiroshima on August 6th. The city of Nagasaki was bombed a few days later on August 9th, and Japan surrendered shortly after on August 15th. World War II may have ended, but a new conflict had just begun: the Cold War. Although the Soviet Union was technically an ally of the United States during World War II, tensions and distrust remained high between the two superpowers. During the war, Russian physicists began theorizing that its Western allies were secretly working on nuclear devices when literature on the subject mysteriously stopped being published in international textbooks, and they brought their concerns to Stalin in 1942. Using sophisticated spy rings, the USSR was able to smuggle out key information about America's nuclear weapon development. But when the Americans announced successful detonations at Trinity, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, the Soviets quickly ramped up their development efforts. They built their first nuclear plant in 1946, and by 1948 had constructed nuclear facilities capable of producing the plutonium they'd need for their nukes. After utilizing the intelligence gathered by their spies, and along with the help of German scientists recruited into their ranks, the Soviets constructed their first bomb, the RDS-1, codenamed First Lightning, in 1949. On August 29th, just over 4 years after the Americans tested their first nuke, the Soviets detonated the RDS-1 in Semipalatinsk, Kazakhstan. The blast yield of 21 kilotons was roughly equivalent to the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Now, it was official. In the post-World War II global order, there were two superpowers, and only they had the technology capable of destroying the entire world. Now, of course, not being considered one of the world's premier superpowers was not something the British could handle. Members of the British government began to worry their country had lost its status among the world powers and decided their country must begin developing its own nuclear weapons program to restore its prestige. The Soviet Union achieving its first test before the British only affirmed the need for them to develop weapons quickly. While the Quebec Agreement allowed British scientists and researchers to assist in the Manhattan Project, the American government ultimately held most of the key secrets and infrastructure needed to developing a nuclear bomb. After a series of spy scandals found British officers directly responsible for nuclear intelligence leaking to the Soviets, the Americans were left feeling that they needed to keep their nuclear secrets closer to home. They ended British cooperation, forcing the UK to develop its own nuclear weapons independently. The UK constructed their first nuclear reactor by 1947, and they shortly began constructing additional plants for uranium and plutonium refinement, which were operational by 1951. Finally, by 1952, and after spending nearly £150 million, or about £3.5 billion in today's money, the British conducted their first nuclear test in the Montebello Islands off the western coast of Australia. Why Australia? Well, because nobody cares about the prison colonies on the bottom of the world, mate.
And as soon as they saw me, they came bounding over.
Like the American and Russian tests, the British tested a plutonium implosion device that yielded about 25 kilotons upon detonation. Although France has a rich history in nuclear research, the country was forced to essentially begin its nuclear program from scratch after World War II. While rebuilding its country and republic from the destruction of World War II, France began working on civilian nuclear projects. They built their first nuclear reactor by 1947 and seemed to be on track to re-establishing themselves as a great power. Then, the 1950s happened. The 50s saw a lot of turmoil for France. Algeria, one of France's prized colonies, began its war for independence in 1954. The Suez Crisis in 1957 further damaged French prestige and prompted the French to develop nuclear weapons to reassert its status as a great power and deter the Soviet bloc from advancing into its sphere of influence. However, the instability was too much for the government to handle, and the Fourth Republic collapsed in 1958. A newer, stronger government was put in place, and the reinstated French president Charles de Gaulle reaffirmed France's commitment to building a nuclear weapon. Despite instability and setbacks, the French were able to power along with their nuke program. After receiving help from the Israelis to secretly develop nuclear processing plants, the French assembled their first nuke by 1960. On February 13, 1960, in the midst of the Algerian War for Independence, the French tested their first nuclear weapon, codenamed Gerboise Blue, in the Algerian desert. The test resulted in a 70 kiloton blast yield, which was larger than all of the first test explosions up to that point combined. Wanting to reestablish itself as a great power, China was worried it could not get the global prestige or achieve its national security ambitions if it didn't develop its own nukes. After the Korean and Vietnamese wars showed Western nuclear powers were willing to use military action to fight communism, Mao Zedong ordered China to begin developing nukes in 1955. Initially, China was able to rely on assistance from its communist neighbors to the north for nuclear secrets and technology, with the USSR helping China build a chemical separation plant to produce weapons-grade uranium and plutonium by 1955. But as the two countries began having border disputes, as well as disagreements over relations with the West and whose version of communism was better, the USSR became less comfortable sharing its nuclear expertise with China. In 1960, the two countries formally severed diplomatic ties and all Soviet nuclear scientists were pulled from the Chinese nuke project. After relying on what was left from the Soviets' collaboration and continued espionage into the Soviets' nuclear program, the Chinese spent 4 years working on what would become known as Project 596. The Chinese were able to independently produce enough nuclear material to construct a bomb and conduct a test in China's far west desert. On October 16, 1964, at the Lop Nur test range, the device, codenamed Miss Q, was detonated, yielding 22 kilotons. This successful test marked the first Asian nation to join the nuclear club, but it would be far from the last. Initially, India's nuclear program consisted of civilian applications, constructing their first nuclear reactor in 1956. Following the Indochina War in 1962, the Indian government felt that nuclear weapons were the only way to defend themselves from its aggressive neighbors. This feeling was only strengthened after the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965. As more and more countries began adding nukes to their weapon stockpiles and countries like India began acquiring the technology and know-how to produce nuclear weapons, the international community grew nervous. India, along with Pakistan and Israel, refused to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968, which barred countries with nuclear weapons from sharing their technology and sought to prevent new countries from developing nuclear weapons programs. India pushed on, despite international pressure, and by 1974, they developed their first nuclear weapon. Their first successful test, codenamed Smiling Buddha, occurred on May 18th in the Pokhran test range in western India. This was the first inaugural nuclear test to be conducted underground, with the estimated explosive yield to be around 5 to 15 kilotons. If there was one country that was going to be existentially concerned with India's first nuclear test, it was Pakistan.
When I will grow up, I will be an army and save Pakistan and destroy India. Strong army, whoa, great!
Pakistan was the next country to join the nuclear club. Created after the British gave up control of India and split it into two countries, Pakistan is surrounded by hostile and aggressive countries in a notoriously unstable region of Asia. Pakistan was able to develop a civilian nuclear program by 1971, but after decades of armed conflicts with its neighbors, the government decided it may be necessary to develop its own nukes. After its arch-nemesis India successfully tested its own nuke in 1974, Pakistan officially launched its nuclear weapons program. After receiving significant funding assistance from Libya, the Pakistani nuke project was able to push forward and was finally deemed a success after they carried out their first cold test of a nuclear device in 1983. Cold tests are essentially tests of the nuclear device's components without the nuclear fuel. It wouldn't be until May 28, 1998, before Pakistan actually tested the destructive capability of its nuclear weapons by testing 5 implosion devices in a series of underground explosions dubbed Chagai 1 in the Roscoe Hills. These tests were estimated to have yielded about 40 kilotons total. Last, but certainly not least, North Korea.
They hate us because they ain't us. That's a great saying, okay? They hate us because they ain't us.
The Hermit Kingdom can trace its desire for nuclear weapons as early as the early 1950s, after the end of the Korean War. Eager to protect the Kim regime from foreign adversaries and legitimize its government, North Korea sought assistance from its communist allies in the USSR and China. Their proposals were initially rejected, but after the United States decided to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea in 1958, the Soviets agreed to help North Korea develop a peaceful nuclear energy program. The first nuclear energy plant in North Korea became operational in 1965 with the help of the USSR. Over the coming decades, North Korean scientists and physicists began expanding their expertise in nuclear technology. By the 80s, North Korea's efforts to independently enrich weapons-grade plutonium was in full swing, and by the 90s they had caught the attention of the international community. The US began negotiating with North Korea to supply them with nuclear reactors for peaceful energy purposes in exchange for North Korea decommissioning the plants they already had that were being used for plutonium processing. The framework for this agreement was dropped by 2002, however, after evidence indicated North Korea was pushing ahead with its nuke program with the help from Pakistan and Libya. Finally, after working for decades to develop its prized nuclear weapons, North Korea finally conducted its first successful underground nuclear test on October 9, 2006. And there you have it. All 8 countries that have ever tested nuclear weapons. Hopefully they never get used.